What's up, guys? Welcome to another Q&A episode. I get this question a lot, and it's finally time. We're just going to jump right into it concerning what are the best modes to shoot in for wildlife photography. So there's three modes that wildlife photographers are usually interested in. There's more modes on your cameras depending on what kind of camera you have, what make and model, and all of that stuff. But there's three of them that are largely across all types. So we're not going to talk about like full auto modes or program modes or anything like that, because if you're into wildlife, if you want to be into wildlife, we're going to kick it up with a little bit more intent in our shooting than that. So we're going to start with the two semi-automatic modes, which are shutter priority and aperture priority mode. So I'm a Canon shooter, and in the Canon world, these are called TV and AV. TV is for shutter priority, AV is for aperture priority. So let's start with the most basic one, the easiest one to understand, I think for most people, is shutter priority. So within our exposure triangle, there's three ways to change the light and the exposure of your image, and that's through your shutter, your aperture, and your ISO. I think for beginners, out of these three things, the shutter is the easiest to comprehend. It makes sense, you know, you have something that comes down and it allows the light to come in. Depending on how long it's open, that's pretty easy to grasp. So shutter priority mode makes a lot of sense for people to gravitate towards that, especially if you don't know a whole lot about the other two, or if you don't know a lot about your cameras, which we're going to talk about in a minute. So starting out in shutter priority, I think is a really great idea for anyone looking to get into wildlife photography and even beyond. Shutter priority is great because it allows you to control what is arguably the most important thing about a wildlife image, and that's the shutter speed. Because wildlife is often not static, and if you're lucky enough to get static wildlife, well, then you can deal with that later in other ways. But first and foremost, making sure you're able to freeze a moving subject is kind of like the most important thing, and shutter priority is great for this. So in shutter priority, you will be in control of your shutter speed, and that's it. The camera will take care of the aperture and the ISO for you, and all you've got to worry about is the shutter speed. And if you have a camera that has an extra mode wheel or a customizable button that will allow you to scroll very quickly or very quickly change exposure compensation, then that's a huge deal. That will basically raise or lower your ISO based on what it thinks is a proper exposure. So if you're hitting proper exposure and your subject and everything's still looking kind of dark to your taste, then in shutter priority mode, you can, instead of adjusting the shutter, which you've already adjusted to what you want, then you adjust the exposure compensation and bring it up or down to deal with the light and the image that you're looking for. I think most of the time, most people can get away with shutter priority mode for wildlife, and it's a great option. But there's a couple of other things. So let's talk about the next option, which is aperture priority mode. And this one isn't, to me, it's not as obvious of a choice for a wildlife photography. And that's because in aperture priority mode, it's the exact opposite of shutter priority mode, right? So you're only controlling the aperture, and then the camera will control the shutter speed and the ISO. Now, there's times where you want to do this because having the most shallow depth of field is not always the best for wildlife, especially because we're shooting at longer lenses. And I've done videos about lens compression and all of that stuff. So if you want to see like how that affects your depth of field, you can check that out. But basically, the longer your lens, the longer your focal length, the shallower the depth of field is. And if you have already a fast lens like an f4 or an f5.6 or whatever, f2.8, all of those are considered moderately fast, especially for wildlife. They're considered quite fast. Then you're going to have very shallow depth of field. And if you want to get more than just the bird's eye in focus, if you want the beak and the side feathers and the tail feathers, or on a big mammal, if it's like, you know, looking at you like this instead of like this, or instead of a side profile, then you're going to have that depth of field right here. You might want to stop it down. So those are some instances where you might want to control your aperture. The downside to this, and this is what most people don't think about or maybe don't realize, is that the camera doesn't know what you're going to do. The camera doesn't know what you're shooting. It's kind of stupid. You have to tell it. And even if you tell it, like, you can't just talk to your camera. You can't just say, hey, camera, I'm going to shoot wildlife today, so don't mess up my shutter speed. It doesn't know that. That's the problem with aperture priority mode, is that if there's not enough light, instead of cranking up the ISO, it will probably lean towards opening your shutter up to a longer shutter speed first before it cranks up the ISO. And in wildlife, you don't want that. You don't want to be trying to shoot something that's moving around or flying or running away or towards you or walking around with a 20th of a second or a 50th of a second even. So there's a way around that. And this is very important for aperture priority mode. But once you put it in aperture priority mode, you can go into your settings and you can change the minimum shutter speed. This will tell the camera that no matter what, it's not allowed to go below this shutter speed. So if you're shooting something that's moving, any type of like big game or birds that aren't moving that much, I still wouldn't go, personally, I usually don't go lower than 200th to 250th of a second. And that's just in case anything happens, if they move a little bit or whatever, or if I'm moving a little bit, because people don't realize that it's not just the animal that moves, it's you that moves. And if you're handheld, then that makes a big difference. So I go in there, if I ever shoot aperture priority mode, which personally I don't, but if I ever were, or if I tell people, that they want to do that, go in there and set the minimum shutter speed to something that you think will fit the scenario that you're in. That way, it'll reduce the chance that you'll have blurry images due to motion blur from your subject. So in both of these cases, the camera is also controlling the ISO, and you can do the same thing with the ISO. If you don't want it to go too high in each of these modes, you can go in there and tell it what to cap your ISO out. So if you have a camera that doesn't do so well with higher ISOs, then you can tell it, don't go above 6400, don't go above 3200, whatever it is, whatever that number is for your camera that you feel comfortable with, you can cap that as well. And you can do that for any of the modes, including manual. So let's talk about manual next. Manual is obviously my favorite. It's the one that I use the most. It's one that I encourage the most. And there's a couple of reasons for that. Firstly, it definitely helps you to get to know your camera. And once you get comfortable with your camera's layouts and what kind of buttons you have, that's the other reason you might be inclined to use the semi-automatic modes like the shutter priority and aperture priority first, is because you might have a camera that doesn't have like a great layout or a great a bunch of thumb wheels and stuff like some of the higher end cameras do. And if you don't have that and you have a camera body where it's just not intuitive or very easy to change either of those settings, either your aperture or your ISO, then that's why these modes might be really helpful. But then let's move up to either you're really comfortable with your layout, you know your camera really well, or you have a great camera that has multiple thumb wheels, and those thumb wheels make it really easy, really accessible, and really fast for you to change everything. So this is where going manual would definitely be in your benefit, because then you have complete control over your image and you're not leaving to chance for your camera to do something that you might not want it to do in any given situation. The only caveat that I personally put to this is that I always shoot in manual mode, and I usually almost always shoot in auto ISO. Especially I shoot in auto ISO when I don't know if the light's changing a lot, if I'm changing places a lot, or if the animals are coming and going. Basically, if I don't know any given second exactly what the exposure is going to be, I'm going to be shooting in auto. I do this for two reasons. One is because to me, the most important thing, period, is getting the shot. And I would rather get the shot and have a high ISO image, a noisy image, than not get the shot at all. And two, cameras have come a long way. If you're shooting with a newer camera, a mirrorless camera, no matter the brand, if it's an intermediate to prosumer to pro level camera, chances are it's going to do a lot better than traditional DSLRs with noise performance. And then of course there's software, there's Topaz and Photoshop and Luminar and so many AI denoising programs out there now that just make a massive game-changing difference for ISO. So those are the two reasons why I just personally I want to almost go so far as to say as I just don't care about ISO anymore. And of course I do, that's a little bit of a stretch of a statement, but you get the point here is that like it's definitely very bottom of the barrel on my list of important things for wildlife photography these days with the gear and the software and the knowledge that I have. What I will say is great about the Canon cameras, if you have anything like an R5, R6, R6 Mark II, R7 even, so they all have a dial. They all have something like this right here, and that is And that dial can be programmed, but typically it's for ISO. And that's really handy because even if you have it in automatic ISO, then the great thing about that dial is by rotating it, it will automatically do exposure compensation for you. So that's the best way for me to do auto ISO and exposure compensation right there. Because there's a lot of times, depending on your metering modes and all of this stuff, the changing of light, or if you have a backlit situation or whatever, or if you have a small animal and the camera might think it's properly exposed, but then your subject turns out too dark. Well, you need to adjust that exposure compensation and add it like on the fly super fast. And that's where having a wheel like that on any of these cameras is a huge difference, or at least knowing where on your camera you can quickly, easily adjust your exposure compensation. Also on the Canon cameras, if you have the RF lenses, a lot of them have this control ring here on the lens, and you can program that to do ISO or exposure compensation too. Again, that might be really beneficial if you have a camera body that is a little more consumer based, a little lower end, that doesn't have that fine tuning. Then if you have an RF lens, then having that control ring might be a big help to you. So on my cameras, this is the R5, and this is very similar for the R6, the R6 Mark II. We have this big, beautiful thumb wheel right here, which is perfect for aperture, and that's by default what it's set up as. And then we've got this guy right here, which is the ISO, and then of course the shutter. So with those three wheels, I have everything that I need to very quickly control all three aspects of my exposure triangle in manual mode, and that's how I like to roll, because I'm kind of a control freak too. I like to have the most control possible as long as it's not interfering with getting the shot. And this then comes down to practice. You really, I can't emphasize enough, you really need to get comfortable with the layout of your own camera and learn the settings and get comfortable with it. And you can do custom settings and all of that stuff with a lot of cameras. But getting to know these three basic modes and how they work and how you work with them and when and why you would want to use them is super important. So hopefully that gives you a good insight into those three modes and how they work and when and why you might want to use them. If you have any questions about these, about anything that I missed or didn't go over, leave those in the comments below. And if you want to see more stuff like this, go check out my wildlife photography playlist and my photography tutorials playlist for basic stuff. I've got all kinds of tutorials in there, from like what is ISO, aperture, shutter speed, the exposure triangle, wildlife for beginners, all kinds of stuff. So you can check those videos out. And of course, any questions you have, leave them down there below and I will definitely answer them. Hit that like button for me if you're still here. I really appreciate it. It's the best thing you can do for my channel. We are about this far away from 100,000 subscribers. Hopefully we hit that in a few weeks. So if you haven't already, definitely subscribe. I really appreciate it. I love you guys for sticking around. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.